Hello everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel, The Political Report. So for today's video, I wanted to create the channel's first 2026 US Senate prediction. Here on your screen, you can see that I'm using the website Yet Another Political Map Simulator to create this Senate projection. So here on your screen, you have all of the seats that are up for the US Senate election here in the year of 2026 for the elections happening in November. To begin the video, I wanted to fill out all of the solid and the safe seats for both the Republicans and Democrats. So I'll begin by doing so now. So for the Democrats, we can begin filling out every single seat that's basically guaranteed to go to them no matter what. That's not even worth discussing in this video. So that would be the Senate seat in Oregon. That can be the Senate seat in New Mexico and Colorado. You can go ahead and include Minnesota, Illinois, and Delaware within the safe seats. Because Republicans are not putting up any candidates or real competition in the state of Virginia, you can go ahead and label that as safe for the Democrats as well. Similarly goes for New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. So that's where things currently stand for the Democrats, just looking at all of the safe and guaranteed seats here. Now, doing the same for Republicans, we can start off with Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, and West Virginia. So here you can actually see both of these parties have a 44-44 tie when you're just looking at all of the safe and guaranteed solidly blue or solidly red states for both the Democrats and the Republicans. So I wanted to use the rest of this video to sort of break down, by margin, whether it's, somewhat lean or tilt or toss-up category for any of these parties and give my official prediction. So I wanted to go in the order of the closest races being last. So I'm going to go ahead and start some of these races here that I think will have a wider margin. So you might be wondering here, why do I not have Montana labeled as Republican? Why do I not have Nebraska labeled as Republican or Florida labeled as safe Republican? At least not yet. I will be labeling some of these as safe Republican in a little bit, but I will explain why. Starting off first with the state of Florida. So in the state of Florida, you can actually see that this is a special election because U.S. Senator Marco Rubio ended up being nominated and confirmed as the United States Secretary of State. So if you go back to 2022, Marco Rubio actually won by a 17 or 16 point margin against Val Demings. So in all honesty and in all likelihood, this is going to be a solid and a safe seat here for Republicans in Florida because literally in the last election, they won by 16 points. If you go to the 2024 presidential election, Trump ended up winning the state here by 13 points. So you have an average of around 14.5 points that Republicans have won here by in the last 4 years. So why am I going over this election here in the 2026? Because it is a special election where appointed U.S. Senator Ashley Moody here, who is the former Attorney General from the state of Florida, she's actually, running for re-election because she was appointed a senator and now she's running for a full 6-year term. So she's essentially the de facto nominee here for the Republicans. There's really not much competition here. It's a clear sweep for her. She's the only main name brand candidate in the race, and she's going against 2 Democratic candidates. So the only one that really has any recognition is Alex Vindman. He's the de facto Democrat nominee at this point, and he's running against Ashley Moody. So with that being said, let's go down to the polls. You can see here that in the polls, Ashley Moody is basically leading all of these polls by around an average of 5 to 8%. You can see here that these polls have anywhere from 7% undecided all the way to 15% undecided. And half of these polls are, bought and paid for, the Democrat here, Alexander Vindman, and his Democratic campaign, where they're showing that he actually has a chance of beating her by 2 points, which honestly, everyone knows is not going to happen. There's no chance of a Democrat winning in the state of Florida in 2026 at this current time, without any major scandals or any, tragic world events happening at the current moment. So Ashley Moody, like I mentioned, is on average ahead by up to 5 to 7 percentage points, but because there are around 14% of the entire state that have yet to be decided here on this election, the majority of those 14%, if not pretty much all of those 14% of undecided voters, did end up voting for Marco Rubio in 2022 and ended up voting for Trump in 2024. So you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the majority of them probably will be voting for Ashley Moody in 2026. And even though the polls might show her winning by around 5 to 7 percentage points right now, I think that it's going to be a definite fact that she's going to be winning by over 10 percentage points in 2026. So that's why if I go back here, I will be rating Florida as a solid or a safe Republican state here, despite the polls maybe showing it might be around 5 to 7 points. I don't think that's true. She's definitely going to win by over 10 points by the time November comes. Now that we're done with Florida, moving over to another safe Republican state that I don't have labeled here just yet is the state of Montana. So the reason I don't have this labeled just yet is because in the state of Montana, we do seem to have a left-wing independent candidate here, Seth Bodner, who is the former president of the University of Montana, running as a left-wing independent candidate here in the state of Montana. Now, he has raised a lot of money. He is a name brand and established figure in the state of Montana because he is the president of their flagship university. He's raised over $1 million, which is a lot more than all of the Democrats have raised combined. And he's running against Republican Kurt Alme. Now, Kurt Alme was the successor hand-chosen by Steve Daines, who at the last second, just minutes before the filing deadline, decided to withdraw and not run for re-election in 2026 for the state of Montana. Now, the reason he decided to do this last minute is because he wanted to ensure Democrats had no chance of running Jon Tester against them, so that Democrats would probably lose this race because they don't have a good candidate. So that's why he decided to install Kurt Alme as a candidate at the very last second. And Kurt Alme has been able to unite the Republican Party, get Trump's endorsement, and he is the de facto Republican candidate here. Now, Democrats, on the other hand, have a bunch of candidates, but really only one of them is a state representative here, and that's Relly Neal. Now, Relly Neal is a former state representative who represented the state of Montana in their 62nd district here for around 2.5 years from 2013 to 2015, but they're really the only one that's held any sort of position in the Democratic Party here. Now you can see they're also the top fundraiser, out fundraising every single other Democrat here by a 10x margin. So that's probably going to be the de facto Democratic nominee here. Of course, we have the independent Seth Bodner, who has received a lot of endorsements from some moderates, some Democrats here in the state of Montana, which is why this state is even being talked about right now, because the fact that there is a left-wing independent candidate here who is running as a moderate campaign seems to sort of mimic the quote-unquote independent campaign of Dan Osborne in the state of Nebraska. However, here, you can see that the Democratic Party is actually having a primary and election process here, and it's not clear whether or not the Democratic Party will try to rig and get rid of their primary elections and try to, shut down their own candidate in favor of moving for a left-wing independent in Seth Bodner. Now, at the current moment, there's no telling sign that that's going to happen because the Democrats are having their primary, and there are no major announcements from Relly Neal saying that they will drop out if they are chosen as the nominee. So the Democrats, for all likelihood, at the current moment, appear to be poised to end up on the November general election ballot. So if that happens, you can actually see here in the polling that if a Democrat is labeled on the ballot in November, that Kurt Alme is going to win by over 20 percentage points here, because the Democratic and moderate vote will be split between Relly Neal and Seth Bodner, where both of them will have around 24 or 26%, and the Republican here will win by over 20%. So that's definitely going to be a safe or a solid margin. The same goes for the fact if Relly Neal is the only one to have ballot access and Seth Bodner were not to run, or if he were to drop out, that Republicans will win here by around 16%, which is also a safe and solid margin. However, when it comes to the scenario that a Democrat ends up dropping out and coalescing and supporting the independent Seth Bodner here, they have this poll as 50-50. Now, this poll is a Democrat internal. This is bought and paid for by the Democrat Party. And this is the same polling firm that has been polling Nebraska a lot of the time for Dan Osborne, that is on the payroll of the Democrat Party to run all of these campaigns and advertisements and strategies for them. So in all likelihood, it's still probably not going to be 50-50. The Republican here will still probably win by 5 to 10 points, even if the Democrats were to drop out and coalesce behind a quote-unquote left-wing independent here. It's still probably going to go to Republicans. The only difference here is, are Republicans going to win by 16 or 20 percentage points, or are Republicans going to win by around 5 to 6 percentage points, depending on what happens. However, at the current point, there is no major indication showing that the Democrats are going to drop out and all endorse the independent bid instead of doing something for their own party. So because the current moment looks like a three-way race in which the Democratic vote will be split between a quote-unquote independent, who's really a Democrat, and an actual Democrat, it seems like Republicans will be cruising to victory here. So with that being said, I was going to go back and label Montana as a safe and solid Republican state here. So that puts our Democrats at 44 and our Republicans at 46, with the baseline of going over all of the solid and safe states here. So with the safe states out of the way, I still wanted to continue in the order so that the closest states will be last here in my prediction. So the next state I have here is the state of New Hampshire. Now, you might be wondering, is New Hampshire really a toss-up or, a seat where Republicans have a chance? Because Republicans haven't won New Hampshire or held a seat in New Hampshire in over a decade and a half. What odds do Republicans have here? And the odds really aren't the best for Republicans here because Democrats already have their candidate in Chris Pappas, who is a U.S. House of Representatives member. He is somewhat of an overperformer in his congressional district. That's sort of a toss-up in the state of New Hampshire, and he is an 8-year incumbent in Congress for the state. However, the Republicans were able to get their second-place recruit here, John Sununu. Now, John Sununu is a former senator from the state of New Hampshire around 20 years ago, and he is the brother of Chris Sununu. So Republicans were actually trying to get Chris Sununu to run here, but Chris Sununu, who was, the former governor of New Hampshire for 8 years, who won his elections here by nearly dictator margins. He was winning a Democratic state by 15 points, 32 points. He was really a Republican outlier here in the state of New Hampshire, and a lot of Republicans are trying to get him to run for election in this seat. However, Chris Sununu ended up rejecting that offer and decided not to run in this election, even though it would have been a safe and guaranteed Senate seat for him. So instead, the next best thing Republicans had here was if his brother, a former senator, would actually run for the seat, and that's what ended up happening. So you can see here that at the end of last year, the former GOP senator from the state of New Hampshire, John Sununu, the brother of former governor Chris Sununu, ended up announcing his bid for the U.S. Senate. So Republicans have somewhat of a two-way race here between Scott Brown and John Sununu. However, ever since John Sununu announced, Scott Brown really has no chance of winning the primary. You can see that Sununu is in the 70s in the polling, and he's essentially the de facto Republican nominee here. So now, if you actually go to the polling, you can see here that it actually shows John Sununu being down by around 5 percentage points on average. Now, as of the most recent weeks, and depending on which poll you actually see, John Sununu is actually within the margin of error. Specifically speaking about the St. Anselm College poll and the Emerson College poll, where in this one, John Sununu is only down by 3 points, and in the other Emerson College poll, he's only down by 1 percentage points, with around 11% of the voters undecided. Now, you can assume that the majority of those 11% of voters are most likely Democrats, because this is, for the most part, a Democrat state, and the polling still has John Sununu down by around 5 percentage points on average, and there are still multiple months to go to see how this thing plays out. So being fair to, the real reality of what's most likely going to happen in this race, although John Sununu did have a somewhat of a generous chance here because of his last name and his brother being the former governor, it really seems that Democrats are going to hold this seat as those 11% of undecided voters eventually coalesce behind the Democrat Chris Pappas here. So that's why I would put New Hampshire here as a somewhat lean state here for the Democrats. You can see here I'll put New Hampshire as a lean margin. I think that the Democrats will probably win by around 8 percentage points in New Hampshire by the time all things are said and done. Now, moving on from New Hampshire, the next state that I wanted to cover here was the state of Iowa. Now, Iowa in this current election is going to be a race between current U.S. House of Representatives member Ashley Hinson and State Representative Josh Turek. So you can see here that Josh Turek is the more so establishment nominee here, where he did have a progressive challenger in Zach Walz, who was endorsed by Democrat progressives here, such as Elizabeth Warren, whereas the more so establishment Democratic members ended up endorsing Josh Turek, who was the eventual Democratic nominee. Now, if we go to the actual polling, you can see that Ashley Hinson has been leading Josh Turek in most of these polls. She's been leading initially by 3 points in the Democrat internal, and then again by 4 points in the Democrat internal, with around 11 to 14% undecided in those two polls. Now, outside of this one Echelon Insights poll, that's a real outlier that shows her down by 1 percentage points in April with 9% undecided. Considering this is the state of Iowa and the fact that Trump ended up winning this state by around 12 percentage points or more, the idea that Democrats are going to do a 13-point swing here against a somewhat of a relatively non-controversial candidate here, Ashley Hinson, who's actually outraising her candidate by more than a 2-to-1 funding advantage, because Democrats really see that they have no chance here, which is why they're not throwing money at it to begin with. I think that it's fair to say that the majority of the undecided and other voters will eventually coalesce around a Republican here, Ashley Hinson, and she would most likely end up winning this state by around 5 to 6 percentage points. So I'll be going back to my projection here, and I will be rating Iowa as lean Republican. So the next state I have here on my projection is the state of Nebraska. Now, going on to the state of Nebraska, you may have seen a video on my channel in the past few days going over the Senate election here where I did a preview. You can actually see that at the current moment, this is a three-way race where Republicans are facing off against Democratic candidate Cindy Burbank and independent candidate Don Osborne, where if you remember Don Osborne, he was actually the 2024 candidate here against Deb Fischer, where he ended up losing by around 6.5 percentage points after buying and paying for every single poll in the average, artificially showing him up by 1, 2, 3, or 4 percentage points, or being tied 1 week before the election, where he ended up underperforming his own polls by more than 5 percentage points because he bought and paid for all of them to show him winning. Now, this time, he's actually running against a relatively popular Republican here. He's running against Pete Ricketts, who is a former 8-year incumbent governor from the state of Nebraska. Now, he's no longer the governor as he was appointed U.S. Senator of Nebraska, and he actually ended up winning his campaign for U.S. Senator back in 2024 in his own special election, where he won by 25 percentage points. So he overperformed Deb Fischer by around 19 points. So he's a much better candidate than the other Republican in the state, Deb Fischer. So that goes back to this point. Does Dan Osborne have a chance here? The only reason he has a chance to begin with is because he did a backroom deal with the Democrats, where the Democrats all admitted to proposing their own candidate who will follow the process and drop out of the race and remove their name off the ballot in order to help Dan Osborne here in a Democratic primary. So the candidate here, Cindy Burbank, has already promised to endorse and help Dan Osborne once she realizes she has no chance of winning in order to remove all of the Democratic options off the ballot so that Dan Osborne can coalesce and gain all of the Democratic votes or left-leaning votes in the state of Nebraska. And they did the same thing for the Legal Marijuana Now party, which is a left-wing marijuana advocacy party in the state of Nebraska, where the literal Democrats paid money to get their candidate filed in to make sure the candidate drops out and endorses Osborne, essentially rigging two primary systems to have no candidate so that Dan Osborne can be the only left-wing option in the state on the ballot. So where do things currently stand? For the general election, literally every single pundit shows that Republicans are winning because they know Dan Osborne really has no chance here. Dan Osborne is once again paying for all of the polls. Every single one of these is a Democratic internal, and he shows himself either winning or losing by around 1 percentage points, with the most recent poll that he paid for out of his own campaign showing him winning by 5 points, which is literally not going to happen because there's 0% chance that he ends up winning this state by 5 points. In fact, he's more likely to lose by more than 5 points than win by 5 points to begin with. So on top of that, you can actually see that Nebraska is a Trump plus 21 state. So if he were to win by 5 points, you're talking about a 26-point swing in 2 years, which has never been seen in the modern history of U.S. politics without a massive scandal. So obviously, it's really not going to happen. He's not going to win this election despite paying and buying every single polling firm here to show him up. But the reality is he's not funding enough money compared to the Republicans. He's not polling as good compared to the Republicans when you actually look at the real numbers. And despite rigging the primary process of every single registered party in the state of Nebraska, he is still shown to be the loser here in this race by every single political pundit here out of all of the 7. So that's why I'll be putting Nebraska on the lean Republican scale. The only reason it's lean here is because he is labeled as an independent candidate, and I do think he'll probably end up losing by around, 5 to maybe 8 percentage points here instead of a safe 10. So that's it for all the lean Republican states here, and I'm going to go on to the lean Democratic states. So for the lean Democratic states, I wanted to start off with the state of Georgia, where you can see here that for the state of Georgia, they have an incumbent U.S. Senator here, Jon Ossoff. Now, Jon Ossoff ended up overperforming the polls and winning his runoff election back in 2021 against incumbent Republican David Perdue by around 1.3 percentage points. Now, Jon Ossoff is one of the best fundraisers in U.S. Senate history, where he has already raised $78 million just on his own campaign finances, not including the Democrats' external finances that will help him in this election. He's on track to raise over around $120 million, which will probably break whatever U.S. Senate record here for an individual Democratic candidate raising money for a Senate election, not counting their own party's money that's spending money on them. And for the Republicans don't even have a nominee yet. they have either Mike Collins or Derek Dooley. Now, this is sort of a proxy war between the Kemp base in Georgia, who has endorsed Derek Dooley, and the Trump base in Georgia, who has endorsed Mike Collins here. You can see Mike Collins is actually the one getting the majority of the support because he is more Trump aligned, and you can see that Mike Collins ended up making the runoff with Derek Dooley, and in the runoff, all the polling shows Mike Collins beating Derek Dooley by around 5 to 16 percentage points, depending on which poll you look at. So with that being said, it looks like it will be a race between Mike Collins and Jon Ossoff by the time November rolls around. So let's go to the actual polling. You can see here in the polling, Mike Collins is basically losing every single poll. There have not been that many polls in the last 6 months. In fact, there's only been 2 polls in the last 6 months, but both polls by somewhat reputable pollsters. You can see here that Emerson College conducted their own poll where Mike Collins is down by 5 with 9% undecided, and Jon Ossoff is up by 7 in this Echelon Insights poll, which I think is probably a bit too generous for Jon Ossoff being up by 7, but the fact that there is 5% undecided, the majority of these undecided voters probably voted for Jon Ossoff back in 2021 in his runoff election anyway, so I think Mike Collins really has no chance of winning here. Whatever chance of winning there was to begin with are definitely all gone if Derek Dooley is a nominee. So despite this being a Trump +2 state in 2024, Jon Ossoff is such a strong and financially backed candidate here that Mike Collins is projected to lose by around 4.3 points at a minimum, and I actually think he'll probably lose by around 7 or 8. I think Jon Ossoff will overperform the polls and probably win closer to 7.5 percentage points than the current 4 he's polling at. So I will be putting Georgia in the lean Democrat margin here for November. Moving on to the next lean state, I wanted to go to North Carolina. So North Carolina is a war between Michael Whatley, the former Republican National Committee chair who managed the finances and the Trump 2024 election, helping Trump and the Republicans win at a national scale in the 2024 elections just 2 years ago. He is the nominee here for the Republicans in the state of North Carolina, whereas the Democrats have nominated their former North Carolina governor from 2 years ago, Roy Cooper, who is a serial overperformer in the state of North Carolina and a very popular Democratic governor there in the state. So when it came to the Republican primary, despite Michael Whatley being the frontrunner and being the one that was most endorsed, he actually performed very poorly. He only ended up getting around 64% of the vote in a race that was otherwise uncontested, showing a very bad performance for him even in the primary, despite him basically being the de facto nominee. Whereas Roy Cooper was able to suck up all of the Democratic support and all of the endorsements, winning over 92% of the vote to begin with. So off the bat, just looking off the primaries, it is a bad sign for the Republicans. Now, if you go to the general election polling, this is where things begin to get a lot worse. If you look at the polling, there hasn't been a single poll in the last year that shows Michael Whatley even up. The best poll for him was still around a year ago where he was just tied. But since then, he's been losing by around 3, 6, 8, 7, probably around, 3 to around 11 percentage points on average, depending on the poll. And you can actually see here that all of these polling firms and aggregates show him down by around 9 percentage points, some of them even closer to 10 percentage points. And the fact all of these polls still have 10% undecided, and Roy Cooper already has a floor of 49.2%, it really shows that Roy Cooper has a higher chance of winning by double digits than Michael Whatley has in winning in general. So I think this race is definitely going to be a lean Democratic pickup here for the Democrats in this 2026 election. And there might be a small chance where Roy Cooper actually ends up winning by 10 percentage points or more. However, I think that the current margin in polling there is around pretty fair at giving him a 8 percentage point lead, where I do think he will win by around 7 to 8 percentage points, at least as of now. So after all the lean seats are said and done for both the Democrats and Republicans, that leaves us at Democrats 47 and Republicans 48. So at the current point, this is still somewhat competitive. Both parties seem to have a chance at controlling the Senate here, but I wanted to go to this next state here that I actually think I could possibly make the argument that it should be lean instead of being tilt. However, for the sake of the current moment, will be putting this as a tilt Republican state. And of course, I am talking about the state of Texas. Now, for those of you who have been paying attention to the state of Texas, you would know that the Republican nominees here was initially John Cornyn, the incumbent U.S. Senator, the incumbent 4-term U.S. Senator, who was a 24-year incumbent, who ended up losing to Ken Paxton in the runoff by a landslide margin, where Ken Paxton beat him by around 27 percentage points, despite being an outsider, at least in the sense of not being the incumbent, despite him actually being, the incumbent attorney general for the state of Texas. John Cornyn got the vote handed to him, where he outraised Ken Paxton by over $100 million, yet still lost by 27 percentage points, really energizing the right-wing side of the GOP base. Whereas the Democrats had their own contested race, which was essentially a proxy war between the black voters in the state of Texas and the liberal white voters in the state of Texas, where you can see here that Jasmine Crockett ran against James Tallarico, where James Tallarico ended up winning by around 6 percentage points. Now, for those of you who know demographics and geography, you can see here that the entire eastern part of Texas, where Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, all of the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area, and the Houston metro areas are, has a very high black population. And essentially all of the black voters voted for the black candidate here, who was Jasmine Crockett. And all of the white voters voted for James Tallarico, who is around the Austin base area. So you can see here that James Tallarico only won his primary by around 6%, and he barely had any of the black vote to begin with, because all of the black voters voted for their black candidate, Jasmine Crockett. So despite him not really getting any of the black support in the primary, he did end up winning because there are simply more white Democrats than black Democrats in Texas. So he did win by around 6 percentage points. Now, James Tallarico is going against Ken Paxton here, and he has been leading some of the polls, at least the most recent ones, by around 1 to 3 percentage points. Now, a lot of these polls are really, really bad polls. Polling in Texas notoriously sucks the more back you go. For example, the polling in Texas showed Beto O'Rourke winning in 2018. It showed Biden possibly winning in 2020. It even showed Colin Allred beating Ted Cruz. And once again, I'm not surprised you see a Democratic bias here in the polls, where they're showing James Tallarico currently up by around 3 percentage points, with around 10 to 13.5% voters undecided on the average poll. Now, I shouldn't need to remind everyone that Texas is a state that voted for Trump by over 13 percentage points literally less than 2 years ago. So the fact that they're implying that James Tallarico was up by 3 percentage points would imply that there is a 16-point swing to all in the direction of Democrats in less than 2 years in a state that has had a relative population of over 40 million people. The idea that there is a 16-point shift in such a big state like that without any massive scandals or demographic changes or makeup in the state. In fact, whatever changes there are is favoring Republicans because of all of the Republicans moving to Texas and not actually favoring the Democrats at all, really shows that this polling is really off at the current moment and biased towards Democrats. But it does seem to be fixing itself and adjusting, because they did show James Tallarico up by around, even 8 percentage points here, which is really a stretch and an inaccurate poll, to only being up around 3 percentage points since the primaries took off for the runoff on the Republican side. I think at the current moment, Ken Paxton will probably win by at least 3 percentage points, which is not a comfortable margin here for Republicans in the state of Texas at all, because Ken Paxton does have some minor scandals and skeletons in his closet, which is why he was impeached over 3 years ago, back in 2023, in the state of Texas. But pretty much all of the scandals Ken Paxton has is already known and has been aired out to the public, whereas James Tallarico has a viral video clip about him every single week, showing that he is he's more so of a progressive white liberal who says a lot of controversial things, that's more democratic and progressive coded than the quote-unquote moderate Christian Democrat he claims to be. When if you actually look at his past statements in his record, it's anything but a moderate, quote-unquote Christian Democrat here. And those scandals and those videos are going to keep airing about James Tallarico, despite how much money he wants to throw at this race and the Democrats here. It's a state where Democrats will be fighting from behind. I think at the current moment, Ken Paxton is favored to probably win by around 3 percentage points, but I could very easily see that by the time November comes, if Ken Paxton ends up winning by over 5 or maybe closer to 8 percentage points in that range. But for now, I think I can put this at a tilt Republican state, where I think Ken Paxton will probably win by around 3 percentage points. And the next state here I have is the state of Ohio, that I also think will be going to Republicans at around a tilt margin. So if you go to the 2026 election here in Ohio, this is a special election because J.D. Vance won in 2022. However, he was elected as vice president. So instead of 2028, this election will be occurring in 2026 for a full 6-year term. So that means that incumbent U.S. Senator John Husted, who is a former lieutenant governor and is a 26-year incumbent for politics in the state of Ohio, both at a statewide and district-wide level. He is a very popular name-brand figure who has won multiple and various statewide elections in the state of Ohio as a Republican and has won all of them by landslide margins. going against former ousted Democratic Senator here, Sherrod Brown, who ended up losing to a no-name outsider, Bernie Moreno, in 2024. He actually lost here in this Senate race by around 3.5 percentage points, despite him being favored in all the polls. If you actually go back to the polls here, they all had a Democratic bias showing that Sherrod Brown was winning the entire time. They literally have a year and a half saying Sherrod Brown's going to win just for him to lose by around 4 points. So he really underperformed the polls, and the polls were very biased in favor of Democrats, at least at the early stages. And this is not a new trend. If you actually go back to the 2022 election, all of the polls here were very biased in favor of Democrats, where they actually showed J.D. Vance losing pretty much every single poll up until election season actually happened. They showed Tim Ryan here being favored the entire summer, and even going into October, they showed that Tim Ryan was favored up until around the week before the election, where every single poll showed J.D. Vance winning. But you can really see here how biased and inaccurate these polls are here in the state of Ohio. And coincidentally, all of the bias seems to always be in favor of the Democrats here, when it comes to the early polls at least. So what are the early polls saying right now in the state of Ohio? The early polls right now are saying that Republicans are actually going to win by 3 points. So if it's already saying Republicans are going to win by 3 points this early on, usually at the time that Democrats have the most favorable polling, the margin they're actually going to win by will probably be more than 3 percentage points. But at the current moment, because there aren't that many voters undecided, it's only 5% undecided, it can't really move that much more than 3 percentage points. I think Jon Husted will win by at least 3 to 5 points here. Despite Sherrod Brown, trying to make a comeback, I don't think he is simply good enough of a candidate, or that Ohio is that Democrat of a state anymore for him to be winning in a comeback bid. So I will say that Jon Husted here would win by around 3 to 5 percentage points, and I'll consider that a tilt margin because it's less than 5 on my map here. So I'll give it to Ohio. I think it is going to be somewhat close here, where Jon Husted has a floor of around 3 percentage points in a victory, but I could see him going to around 5 points and beating Sherrod Brown here. So you can see here on the map that Republicans have reached 50 seats here in the Senate, which means in my prediction, just off this alone, I think Republicans are projected to hold the Senate. So no matter what happens in these last 3 seats, Democrats have already lost the Senate elections if all of this plays out. So you can see that there are 3 states left here. There is Alaska, Michigan, and Maine. The next state I'll be going into is the state of Alaska. Now, Alaska is actually, I think, going to be the closest race of the entire cycle. Although, as of right now, I don't think it is the closest because of the polling. I think when all things are said and done, it will be the closest. So you might be asking why I think this. So Alaska has a unique nonpartisan top 4 primary system where elections will be held in August 18th, 2026, where all the Republicans, Democrats, third parties, and independents will all show up on the same ballot. And I think at that point in August, we will have a clear picture of where this election is going to go because both Republicans and Democrats will be on the same ballot. So with that being said, however, who are the candidates? The candidates are Dan Sullivan, who is a incumbent U.S. Senator for the state of Alaska. You can actually see here that he won his election in 2014 and in 2020 against a Democratic incumbent and against a Democratic independent. So he's actually going against Democratic Party and former U.S. House of Representatives member from the state of Alaska, Mary Peltola. Now, Mary Peltola, if you remember, she was a Democratic firebrand here in the state of Alaska, where she actually ended up winning by over 10 percentage points, or nearly 10 percentage points in 2022, and won her special election here back in 2022 by over 3 percentage points in a state that Trump won by more than double digits here. He actually won by around 10 points in the 2020 election, and in the 2024 election, Trump ended up winning by around 11 percentage points here. However, you can see that in 2024, because it was on the same ballot as Trump won by over 11 percentage points. The best Mary Peltola could do was around 48% of the vote, meaning she lost by around 2.5 percentage points. So she literally overperformed Kamala Harris by 7.5 points in Alaska back in the 2024 election. So that's why she is such a good and overperforming candidate here for the Democrats. And Democrats hail Mary, and the literal only possible candidate that has a chance of winning the state of Alaska here for the Democrats. And they were able to recruit their landslide candidate here in Mary Peltola. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. When you look at any of the polling, Mary Peltola is actually significantly in the lead. Now you can see all of the polls here are by around just two polling firms here. They're all Data for Progress, which is a Democrat internal poll, and Alaska Survey Research. Now, Alaska Survey Research is also biased towards Democrats, as they have done some polling and some analysis for Democrats in the past and have been paid by them. However, you can see in all of these polls that Mary Potowa has taken a substantial lead, where it was around a 3 percentage points, and then she was losing by around 5 percentage points, and then it was plus or minus 1 or 2 points to see how much she was winning by. But as of recent, she's been winning by around 5 percentage points or 6 percentage points, and she has really began to run away with the race. So Democrats are at a really good spot here, and they are averaging a margin of around 4 percentage points. Now, the pundits are showing that this is either going to be a toss-up race or favoring Republicans. However, I think Mary Potowa, like I said, she did outperform Democrats by around 7.5 points. So even though this polling is probably biased towards Democrats, she is the type of person who will overperform and has a very good chance of beating Dan Sullivan here. The only thing going against her is the fact that the polling in Alaska is horrible and is not accurate. So you can say, okay, maybe you want to throw out the polling, which is why I'm referencing the 2024 actual election results as my basis for why I think she will win. So that's my current prediction in the state of Alaska. I think she will win. But the reason a lot of Republicans are using here for thinking Republicans have a chance of winning are the 2020 polls. So you can see here that Republican Dan Sullivan is going against quote-unquote independent Al Gross here, who was running as an independent. And in the polling, it showed it to be a neck-and-neck race, where it says that the independent was winning or that Dan Sullivan was only winning by around 3 percentage points, right? Pretty much every single one of these polls showed this being within a 3-point margin. However, when all things were said and done, Dan Sullivan ended up winning by 12.5 points, which is a 9.5 overperformance on those polls. So if Dan Sullivan were to overperform by around 9.5 percentage points here, he'd win by around 6. But Mary Potowa also overperformed by around 7.5 percentage points. So the real question here is, will Dan Sullivan overperform the polls by more than Mary Potowa actually overperforms her election results? And I tend to trust election results more than actual polling. So that's why I think at the current moment, based on where things stand, Mary Potowa will squeak out a victory. I think at the current moment will be around 3 percentage points, but I think by the time November comes, it will kind of get closer to around 1 percentage point. But I will be giving this in a very tiltiest of margins to the Democrats here. So Democrats will now have 48 seats in the Senate, according to my analysis. Next, I'll be going to the state of Maine, where Republicans have their presumptive nominee here, Susan Collins, against a Democratic presumptive nominee here, who is Graham Plattner. Now, Graham Plattner is a Democratic progressive here. He, I think, was a former harbor man in the state of Maine, and he's sort of been seen as the Maine Mamdani here in the race, as a Democratic progressive candidate and on a younger spectrum and backed by Bernie Sanders and a lot of the left-wing side of the base. Now, in all of the polling, Graham Plattner has essentially forced Janet Mills to drop out of the race because he had such a wide lead for the Democrats, and the Democrats had no chance of contesting him for the Democratic primary. But even in the general election, he has taken a lead here, where he has been shown winning by around, anywhere from 2 to 9 percentage points for all of the recent polls. Now, a lot of this has controversy because of the many scandals that Graham Plattner has. First, starting with a scandal saying here on the screen, I'm not going to say the word, but because of a tattoo he had, somewhat representing what a lot of German soldiers would be wearing during World War II. And he claims to have not had any knowledge of the symbol. He simply got a Third Reich symbol on his chest for around 20 to 30 years without knowing what it was, until he eventually got it covered up because it was reported and leaked to the press. Then later on, it was revealed that he made racist and sexist posts on his Reddit account where he said a lot of hurtful things that a lot of Democrats were concerned about. However, the Democratic Party decided to back him, saying that those things are not disqualifying and that they still support him as a candidate. And now finally, in the past few days, he was actually hit with a sexting scandal where it was actually reported that he was cheating on his wife by sexting multiple other women while on a campaign trail. And this was actually reported internally in the campaign until a Democratic staffer leaked this to the press. So this is just his third scandal in really the last 3.5 months, and this man seems to have more and more skeletons in his closet, the longer time goes on, which is actually something that both the Democrat Janet Mills said and Republicans are saying in this race, that they are saying that they have even more scandals on Graham Plattner, and that this is just the beginning, that they're actually waiting until September or October to drop even more scandals that can harm him. However, you can actually see in the polling, every single scandal he gets, he seems to be doing even better in the polling. And Democrats really aren't affected that much by scandals as much as they used to be, or compared to Republicans who have to face scandals. which is why Graham Plattner here is still seen to be polling at around plus 7% on average, beating Susan Collins. Now, the one thing Republicans have here is the fact that Susan Collins is a godsend here for the Republican Party. You can actually see here, if you go back to the 2020 election, when Trump lost Maine by around 8 percentage points, she actually won Maine by around 8 percentage points. She won 51 to 42, which is a 16-point overperformance compared to Trump in 2020, which was the biggest overperformance for a Senate and presidential ticket in any modern election history since 2016. She was able to outperform Trump by around 15 to 16 percentage points. And not only did she outperform Trump by 15 to 16 percentage points, she actually overperformed the own polling here by around 15 to 16 percentage points, where they only showed her winning by around 6 points. There was literally not a single poll since June of 2020 that showed her winning, and she ended up winning by over 8 percentage points, overperforming the average 6.5 percentage points by more than 14. So the one thing Republicans have here is the fact that she literally overperformed anywhere from 14 to 16 percentage points, and the fact that she's only down 7, she can technically win even if the polling shows her down 15 if you just go off the basis of her last overperformance. Now, of course, assuming everything will play out just like last time and just simply moving the number of an overperformance for 2020 and assuming the same thing will happen in 2026 is not, the best data to have, especially if that's the only metric you're relying on. But for Republicans, that's really the only string of hope they have here besides the scandals that shows Susan Collins actually having a chance of winning. But at the current moment, the polling lead is too big for Graham Plattner. The other scandals that appeared hasn't seemed to hurt him, and I have no idea what other scandals they plan on releasing about him later in the year, and I don't want to predict the future. So for the current moment, I will say Graham Plattner, I think, will probably win by less than 5 percentage points, probably closer to a tilt margin here. So I'll be putting this as a tilt seat for the Democrats here in Maine, where Democrats are now at 49 and Republicans are at 50. So for my final race here, I actually wanted to go to the Michigan election here, where in the state of Michigan, you actually have a three-way race with all of the Democrats. You can see here that the Democrats here in the state of Michigan are split between Democratic Socialist Abdul El Sayed, Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow, and U.S. House of Representatives member Haley Stevens. So in this race, a lot of the main, grassroots candidates want to support Mallory McMorrow because she's a local state senator, whereas the Democratic establishment wants to support Haley Stevens because she's already in Congress, whereas the left-wing socialist and progressive side of the Democratic base want to support Abdul El Sayed. Now going down to the endorsements, you can see all of the left-wing and socialist candidates here all endorse Abdul El Sayed. You can actually see the extreme left of the party all decided to back him, whereas a lot of local people decided to back Mallory McMorrow, and a lot of the Democratic establishment, the Nancy Pelosi types, a lot of the U.S. senators and representatives, stuff along those lines, ended up supporting Haley Stevens because she's already in Congress. However, you can see that in the polling, this is a neck-and-neck race right now between Haley Stevens and Abdul El Sayed, where El Sayed was in third at the beginning. However, as of the most recent polls, this seems like the leftist candidate here, Abdul El Sayed, has been surging. He's actually the front runner now with 28 percentage points of the vote in the Democratic primary, and presumably going to be the Democratic nominee at the current point. However, there is a high chance Haley Stevens picks this up because, as mentioned, this race will be happening in August, so there's still more than 2 months for any of these positions to change. Now, the thing for Democrats here is the fact that letting their most leftist and socialist voters here vote could actually end up screwing them over in the general election, because you can see here the Republicans are actually rerunning their U.S. Senate candidate here, Mike Rogers, who did very good in the 2024 elections. And you can see here that Mike Rogers is actually pretty much beating Abdul El Sayed in nearly every single poll that has been conducted. He is in the lead, and he's actually averaging a win by around 1.5 percentage points in a state that voted for Trump for only 2.5 percentage points. Whereas when it comes to Mallory McMorrow, it's sort of 50-50. There are some of these races where McMorrow wins, and some of these races Mike Rogers wins. Whereas for Haley Stevens, she actually performs the best against Mike Rogers because there are a handful of polls showing her beating Rogers by over the margin of victory. So the only way Democrats really lose this race here is if they nominate Abdul El Sayed. And even if they do nominate Abdul El Sayed, Mike Rogers is only up by around 1.5 points. So the simple thing, if Democrats want to win here, is just not to pick him as your nominee, and this wouldn't even be considered as a toss-up race here. It would probably be, likely Democrat or lean Democrat. But because Abdul El Sayed is surging and he's the most leftist candidate out of the three, this really seems to turn off some of the independent and moderate voters in the state and is giving Mike Rogers a chance and a path to victory, where otherwise other candidates really don't show a clear one here for Mike Rogers. So I think depending on the candidate here, this is either going to be a very, very tilt race, where I think Abdul El Sayed will probably win by the very slimmest of margins. And he's probably the only one that can make this race close. Whereas if this race goes to Haley Stevens, this is probably going to be a likely Democrat race here. So with that, the rating will be, if Abdul El Sayed is the candidate, I think that this would be a tilt margin here in the state of Michigan, being the third tilt seat that Democrats end up winning here, tying the Senate at 50-50. However, because J.D. Vance is the vice president, Republicans end up winning the Senate because the vice president breaks any ties that occur in the U.S. Senate. However, if Haley Stevens is the nominee, I think this is probably closer to a likely margin here for the Democrats in Michigan. However, the Democrats leftists there in the state are making it impossible for Haley Stevens to win, apparently, and Abdul El Sayed will be the candidate, it seems like. So I'll be putting this as a tilt margin. So as you can see here, this will be one of the only, evenly divided U.S. Senate elections, in recent or modern U.S. Senate history. You can see here I have Democrats with 50 and Republicans with 50, with a total of 5 races being in a very, very tilt margin. 3 of them favoring the Democrats here in Alaska, Michigan, and Maine, and 2 of them favoring Texas and Ohio, where I can really see Texas and Ohio have a chance of going lean, and Michigan and Maine also have a chance of going lean. And even Alaska, I think, will probably remain the only true toss-up here. But in all the other states, this is probably something that's going to be a very, very close Senate election. And in these 3 to 5 states, you're really going to have to go down all the way in the stretch, all the way to November, to see if any scandals or if any changes end up shaking up the race and flipping the toss-up category or the tilt category to the other party. So that's all I had for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed my first U.S. 2026 Senate election here for the month of June for the 2026 election year. I will try to make these videos around once a month, every single month until the elections happen in November, with my final prediction being, around the week of November. But I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you have any video suggestions, please leave them down below in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to leave a like and hit subscribe, and let me know what you want to see next in my future content. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.